Library Foundation. Welcome and thank you for joining us this evening for the first of two of our programs to recognize those who serve in our nation's armed forces. On November 11th, 1991, President Bush spoke at a wreath-laying ceremony at Arlington National Cemetery at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. He said the United States will always be a force for peace in the world. But the peace we seek is a real peace, the triumph of freedom and prosperity, not merely the absence of war. He continued by observing that we take as our hope the prophecy of Isaiah, that nation shall not live sword against nation, neither shall they learn war. And yes, we hope, we pray, that as the years progress, the face of war will be seen in our distant. But the memory of our veterans and their sacrifice will never fade. This evening we gather to again ensure that the memory of our veterans and their sacrifice will never fade. Many of our nation's veterans have continued in service after their time of active duty has come to an end. One such outstanding veteran and patriot is this evening's special guest, Major General John S. Cowings. A native of the Bronx in New York City, General Cowings has earned degrees from New York University, Golden Gate University in San Francisco, and the United States Army Command and Staff. Having provided logistics operations support to U.S. and allied forces around the globe, both in times of peace and war. General Cowings served in combat infantry divisions in Korea, Vietnam, and Australia. He also served in the Chiefs of Staff as Commandant and President of the Industrial College of the Armed Forces in Washington, D.C. General Cowings holds the Distinguished Service Medal, the Legion of Merit, 2 awards of the Bronze Star Medal for operations, combat, and other decorations. When our speaker served during the Vietnam War, then young Army Captain Cowings commanded U.S. troops in combat during the 1968 Tet Offensive. Ladies and gentlemen, when we recognize those who have served in our nation's armed forces, retired Major General John S. Cowings is a sterling example of our nation's quest for a real peace, the triumph of freedom and prosperity. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming General Cowings.
Thank you, Mr. McClure, Fred. A very generous introduction. I mean, after all, it isn't every day that one gets to be around to hear his own eulogy being read. Mr. McClure, Mr. Finch, Commissioner Cawley, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your kind attendance and being here this evening. I should point out right at the start, however, that although we're here in the halls of academia, but my remarks are not intended to be a scholarly presentation. Oh, I once may have had delusions about being a scholar many years ago, but those delusions were dashed on one particular day when I was called upon. I was stationed at the Pentagon at the time, and I was called upon to go over and give a no-notice presentation over at the Executive Office building of the White House, adjacent to the West Wing, to a very senior government official. I won't mention any names. I'll merely say it wasn't the President of the United States, but I was still pretty nervous. And when I arrived over there on the White House grounds, I discovered that I wasn't the only one presenting that day. There was also an Air Force officer and a naval officer. And the gentleman that we were briefing, this senior government official, was seated at the back end of a long, narrow conference room, and his face was kind of in the shade, and he had his hands folded, if you can kind of picture this, on the table in front of him. Well, the first person to stand up to brief was the Air Force officer. And what can I say? If Hollywood's central casting were looking for an Air Force officer, this is the guy they would have found. I mean, a tall, good-looking guy, great shock of white hair, immaculate in his blue uniform, ribbons up to here. He gave a clean, crisp, highly educated presentation full of geopolitical nuances about the particular hotspot in the world that we were discussing that day. And he was followed by the naval officer, and if you can believe it, she was even better than the Air Force officer. Articulate, very erudite in her delivery. She gave a very in-depth and highly educated presentation. Then it came my turn to brief. Standing there, remember, I had no notice, advance notice about this presentation. I'm standing there, my uniform kind of a bag of wrinkles. Very nervous because I'm briefing a senior government official for the first time in my life. Losing my hair even back then as a young major. So I just kind of stood erect and gave it the typical Army-style briefing, you know, down and dirty. This is the way the Army sees the situation. And when I finished my remarks, I was about to leave the lectern and resume my seat when all of a sudden this gentleman that we were briefing, this senior government official, he leaned forward into the light and he said to me, "You know, Major, at least you Army officers don't pretend to be intellectuals." And I'm telling you, I guess the gentleman was right, because at the time, I thought he was paying me a compliment. So that's what I mean when I say that this evening's remarks are not intended to be a scholarly presentation, but rather a salute to some of our nation's unsung military veterans. Think of this evening as kind of opening a window to a view of our nation's history that we don't often see. So tonight, ladies and gentlemen, with your kind indulgence, I'd like to present a somewhat unique perspective of selfless service to one's country. And I will use as the medium for my talk the pages of United States military history. U.S. military history has long been a hobby of mine, at least when I was a younger man, because I had found within its pages what I refer to as a hidden heritage of pride. In my 32-plus years in the military, through the good times and the bad, in peace and at war, I was proud every single day to wear my country's uniform. But I would always get a special feeling of pride whenever I would delve into the pages of U.S. military history. So come with me now on a journey back through time and employ your imaginations, if you will, as we transform this auditorium into our very own time travel machine. And we travel back in time 100 years, 200 years, back 242 years. The date is the 5th of March in 1770. The place, Boston, Massachusetts. You are standing on a site that will be recorded in U.S. history as the site of the Boston Massacre. You're standing in a square with a large group of demonstrators, early patriots. You and your friends and neighbors have come here today to protest the iniquity of British rule as applied to the colonies. And the mood of the crowd is angry. There on one side of the square, in front of the old State House on King Street, stands a group of young men, young demonstrators, early patriots. And they're led by a sailor. Now, to the other side of the square has suddenly appeared a detachment of British dragoons. Their commander has received word today to clear the square of demonstrators before the crowd can turn ugly. And the British commander gives the word to disperse, but very few among the crowd pay him any heed. But then suddenly someone in the crowd actually bends down and picks up a stone and hurls it at the dragoons. Now, with that action, the British commander withdraws his saber and he gives a crisp command, and the dragoons, acting all in unison, a very impressive sight, they affix their long bayonets to the ends of their firelocks with a sharp snap, and they take up the en garde position, prepared to sweep across the square and clear the square of demonstrators. Now, with this show of force, a number of those in the crowd decide that the time is right to leave. But not everyone. and certainly not this group of young demonstrators over in front of the old State House on King Street, these young men. Now, no one knows exactly what was said that day, but it's as if by their act of defiance, these young men seem to be saying that if there is going to be a fight, then let it start here and let it start now. And no one knows exactly what action caused the British commander to give the word to fire on the crowd that day. But when he did and the smoke had cleared, the dead and the dying lay there in the streets of Boston. And now remember, you're employing your imaginations. You're there. So you can picture the pandemonium that has broken out, with people screaming and running in all directions. As the dragoons march with fixed bayonets, shoulder to shoulder, they move across to clear the square of demonstrators. And as they pass by the body of the first fallen demonstrator, the British commander turns to his sergeant and he says, "Examine that body." And the British sergeant kneels down into the dust, and he turns over the body and he stares into the dust-covered face of a sailor. He stares into the face of the first to defy and the first to die in our nation's struggle for independence. He stares into the face of Crispus Attucks, a face that was black. Some 5 years later, a freed slave named Peter Salem fought alongside other colonists at Concord Bridge and at the Battle of Lexington. And all told, some 5,000 African Americans served as regulars in General George Washington's army. So much of our nation's history is unknown to us. But if you search for the truth in the pages of U.S. military history, you will find there what I call a hidden heritage of pride for all Americans. We're continuing on our journey through time. The year is 1812. And once again, America finds itself at war with Great Britain. This time, a young man at the age of 21 joins the Navy. And at the tender age of 21, he's given command of a fighting ship, a man-of-war. He fights in the War of 1812. And in one of those battles at sea, he's taken captive. But he's released at the end of the war. As opposed to returning to civilian life, however, he chooses to remain in the Navy. And eventually he goes on to achieve one of the highest ranks of our then fledgling Navy, that of Commodore. And he's given senior level command as flag officer in command of the entire Mediterranean fleet. Throughout his tumultuous career, he's actually brought some 6 times before a courts-martial board, if you can believe that, because of his unimpeachable character, and because he's not willing to compromise, and because he is a passionate advocate for the humane treatment of sailors. Each time the charges against him are dismissed because his superiors know him to be a man of great courage and moral fiber, despite the institutional discrimination that he has suffered. And today, ladies and gentlemen, should you ever have an opportunity to visit the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis, you just may chance to see his portrait hanging there. And you'll be looking at the face of Commodore Uriah P. Levy, a face that was Jewish. Let's continue on in our time travel. It's now the time of the Civil War. And brother is pitted against brother, neighbor against neighbor, in what can only be described as a bloody cauldron of untold suffering. And when we think about the fact that every combat casualty, every widowed spouse, every orphaned child was an American. The date is the 18th of July in 1863. It's the Battle of Fort Wagner, South Carolina, a battle in which the all-black 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment is to assume the lead in the assault on the Confederate stronghold at Fort Wagner. Comprised of former slaves as well as free men of color from the North, the soldiers of the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment have volunteered to take the lead in assaulting the Confederate stronghold on this 18th day of July in 1863. And on the eve of battle, a night when no soldier could get any sleep, a soldier's prayer, something like this, was probably heard around the campfire. And should it be thy will, O Lord, that we should fall in battle, at least let it be known that we died as men, standing on our feet and facing the enemy. And as they moved to the field on that lonely morning of the 18th of July in 1863, to the cheers and the hurrahs of "On you 54th," a decision had to be made as to who would carry the flag. Because communications were rudimentary at best at the time of the Civil War, the only way that you as a common soldier in the field could know that your side had not yet been defeated and that you were in command of the field was to look for and to follow the flag. If you can see the flag, then you know that the battle is not yet lost. Unfortunately, if you're aware of that, the enemy is aware of that fact as well. And so while military tradition maintains that the soldier selected to carry the flag holds a position of honor, which is true in military tradition, but that same soldier, if you think about it, is also the primary target for every enemy sharpshooter, every volley of musketry, every cannonade from the artillery. What's more, that soldier must sling his weapon across his back to enable him to carry the flag into battle with both hands and move into battle virtually unarmed.
If this man should fall, who will lift the flag and carry on?
I will.
And if this man should fall, who will lift the flag and carry on? A very serious question indeed. And as the Battle of Fort Wagner commenced, and as the men of the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment marched off into the pages of United States military history, the flag bearer was struck, mortally wounded. But before his body could hit the ground, another soldier threw down his weapon, and he grabbed the flag, and he moved to the front of the formation, and he carried the flag that morning. With bullets whistling past his head, with cannonballs exploding all around him. And then he, too, received another terrible wound. But he refused to relinquish the flag despite his wounds. And he carried the flag all the way up to the earthenwork parapets of Fort Wagner and into the very cannon's mouth. And the next day, as he lay wounded at the aid station, surrounded by those few of his comrades who had managed to survive the terrible battle at Fort Wagner, he said these words recorded for U.S. history as he choked through his pain, but with a voice filled with unit pride. Quote, "The flag never touched the ground. the words spoken by Sergeant William Carney, first African American to be awarded the Medal of Honor. Let's continue on our journey through time. The year is 1881. You're in the Old West, Montana Territory, a place where the Buffalo Soldiers maintain the peace and fight the Indian Wars. The Buffalo Soldiers, you may recall, received their nickname, especially those fellows who had the full beard. They received their nickname from the Native Americans because of the similarity of their appearance to the American buffalo, the bison. And the Buffalo Soldiers were commanded by white officers. And on this particular day in 1881, a young white lieutenant named John is given command of a troop of the Buffalo Soldiers from the 10th Cavalry. I should point out here as an aside that at the time of the Indian Wars, there were only 7 cavalry regiments west of the Mississippi River, and 2 of those were Buffalo Soldiers. A fact that's missing from many of our Hollywood movies. When the cavalry comes charging over the hill to rescue the settlers, often it's not. They were Buffalo Soldiers. But let's get back to our story. Our young white officer, his lieutenant, his name is John, but sometimes he just goes by the nickname of Jack. But by whatever name, Jack is different from his fellow white officers because he prefers to train with his troopers and to suffer the same hardships as his men. For his actions, Jack is often ridiculed by his fellow white officers. Jack, they would say to him, you know, you're just as black as your soldiers. But from that early experience in the Old West, there emerged the famous American soldier and leader, General John Blackjack Pershing. And now you know the true story of how he earned his famous nickname. Let's continue on in this time travel. We're now moving from the Old West to the Bay of Santiago in Cuba. The date is the 1st of July in 1898. It's the time of the Spanish-American War. And who can forget Colonel Teddy Roosevelt, the famed Rough Riders, and their valiant charge up Kettle Hill, which history erroneously records as the Battle of San Juan Hill. But when Colonel Roosevelt and the famed Rough Riders and other American forces became pinned down and started taking large numbers of casualties by a determined Spanish force in command of the Heights, well, it was the Buffalo Soldiers of the 9th and 10th Cavalry who came to the rescue that day, along with the soldiers from the all-black 24th and 25th Infantry Regiments, combined which they helped to actually win the Battle of San Juan Hill while rescuing a future president. Teddy Roosevelt, flushed with a taste of victory and with his own narrow escape from death, is reported to have said these words, and I quote, "I will never forget what these soldiers did this day." But you know, time plays tricks on an old soldier's memory. And of course, he did forget. Continuing on our time travel now, it's the time of the First World War. And the very first American troops to engage the enemy were from the 369th Infantry Regiment from New York City, an all-African-American unit, the first unit to engage the enemy. Nicknamed the Hellfighters from Harlem, they were not allowed to wear U.S. uniforms. They were not allowed to carry U.S. weapons. They were not allowed to fight alongside other U.S. troops in the field. So they engaged the enemy wearing the uniform of the French army. And they carried French weapons. And for their heroism, they were the first Americans to be awarded the coveted French Croix de Guerre, equivalent of our Medal of Honor, because they served on the line for 191 days without a foot of ground lost or a man captured. We now move to the time of the Second World War. The date is the 20th of July in 1942. The place, Fort Des Moines, Iowa. You are standing on a grassy parade field at Fort Des Moines, Iowa, and standing there with you are 440 officer candidates. This is to be their graduation day from OCS, Officer Candidate School. And those officer candidates stare at the lectern as their colonel walks up and stands in front of the microphone. And the colonel looked out and eyeballed those officers. And this is the gist, not verbatim, but the gist of what the colonel had to say that day. You know, you're different. And because you are different, there are those who feel that you may not make good officers and that you won't make good leaders. But I know that you won't let me down. And I know that you won't let the country down. Because you see, the 440 officers who were standing on the grassy parade field at Fort Des Moines, Iowa, on that 20th day of July in 1942, were all women. This was the first graduating class of the newly established Women's Army Corps. And when those officers stared at the podium, there was no doubt in their mind that they were staring at a tough-as-nails, no-nonsense colonel. But they were staring at the face of a woman, Colonel Ovetta Culp Hobby, first director of the Women's Army Corps, holder of the Distinguished Service Medal. We continue now on our journey through time. It's still the time of the Second World War. The date is the 23rd of May, 1944. We're in the Italian theater of operation, specifically in Carano, Italy. And the young tech sergeant has just taken charge of the remnants of his platoon that is being devastated by 3 machine gun nests to the forward of his position, and they're unable to either withdraw or to advance. Suddenly, this young tech sergeant takes off on his own, firing his Tommy gun and hurling grenades at the enemy. He knocks out the first machine gun nest, then he maneuvers around on his belly, and he destroys the second machine gun. Minutes later, he captures the third machine gun nest. And for good measure, he captures 17 enemy soldiers single-handedly. But his day's work is not yet done, because to the forward of his platoon's position can be heard the unmistakable sound of German armored vehicles as 3 Mark IV tanks move up the road towards his platoon's position. So putting a bazooka on his shoulder and moving from a position of safety on the side of the road, this young tech sergeant takes up a position in the middle of the road, a fully exposed position, and he waits until that lead tank is only 75 yards away, and he fires and destroys that tank. Then he withdraws his individual sidearm and he charges the burning tank, firing his pistol all the time, which caused the other 2 tanks, who are unaware of what's going on, to turn and to flee the battlefield. And as if these Herculean efforts were not enough for a single individual in a single day, he ends up carrying 2 of his wounded comrades a total of 1,700 yards to safety, all the while under enemy fire. Well, when Regimental Field Headquarters hears of this unbelievable display of leadership under fire and courage in combat, the decision is made that this young man will be promoted post-haste to 2nd lieutenant. He will receive a battlefield commission. And when our young man reports into Regimental Field Headquarters, well, the colonel who greets him stands there transfixed, probably with his mouth open, as he stared into the face of Tech Sergeant Van T. Barfoot, later in life to retire as a full colonel, holder of the Medal of Honor. He stared into the face of a Native American. Now, this next historical vignette from the Second World War that I'm going to relate to you, ladies and gentlemen, was classified as top secret until after the end of the Second World War, because it was believed that if the truth were known, it would have had a devastating effect on the morale of troops fighting in the field and a decidedly negative impact on national will here at home. The dates are the 27th through the 29th of October in 1944 in the Hurtgen Forest in northern France. This is the story of the 1st Battalion of the 141st Infantry Regiment, known in U.S. military history as the Lost Battalion. The soldiers of the 1st of the 141st Infantry Regiment were trapped on the top of Hill 645 in the heavily wooded forest of northern France, completely surrounded by a superior German force. Their numbers were being methodically depleted by German artillery rounds that would go off from the tops of the tall trees and rain down death on the soldiers below. A number of attempts were made to get through and to rescue the soldiers of the Lost Battalion because no supplies or reinforcements of any kind could get through them. But all such rescue attempts ended in failure. The would-be rescuers themselves would always come under attack from German artillery, and they always had to turn back. To show just how desperate the situation had become, because no supplies could get through to these soldiers after 3 days, hunger became the new enemy. So, supporting U.S. forces actually fired chocolate bars through their artillery pieces in the hope that some of the candy would fall into the hands of the U.S. troops and help to hold off starvation. Where all other rescue attempts had failed, one lone combat unit stepped to the forefront and volunteered to rescue the soldiers of the Lost Battalion. They were a regimental combat team that had recently seen action in the Italian theater of operation. And this would be an opportunity for them to prove themselves and to show the world what they were made of. And as this unit of rescuers, as they moved to the line of departure that morning at 3 a.m. in the morning, it was so dark that each soldier had to put his hand on the backpack of the soldier in front of him so as not to get lost in the dark. And once the German forces realized that yet another American rescue effort was underway, well, then the artillery shelling began again with renewed intensity and ferocity. But the rescuers would not turn back. They fought on inch by inch to the rescue of the soldiers of the Lost Battalion. At a terrible cost. By the end of the second day, fully 1/2 of their number had either been killed or wounded by the end of the second day. But they would not turn back. Their motto was go for broke. And that is precisely what they would do. On the third day, the fighting was actually hand-to-hand, but the rescuers were finally able to get through and to rescue the remnants of the Lost Battalion at a terrible cost. And when one of these rescuers jumped into a foxhole beside one of the soldiers whom he had fought for 3 days to rescue, and he offered him a drink from his canteen, you can imagine there were tears on all sides. And when one of these soldiers from the Lost Battalion stared into the face of his rescuer, he realized for the first time that he was looking at a face that was Asian. Because you see, ladies and gentlemen, the soldiers who rescued the Lost Battalion during that terrible 3-day battle in October of 1944, they were from the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. And the 442nd Regimental Combat Team has gone down in the annals of U.S. military history as being the highest decorated unit for bravery in combat of any other military unit in any theater of operation throughout the entire Second World War. And the 442nd Regimental Combat Team were all Japanese Americans. Now, every student of history has heard of the Battle of the Bulge during the Second World War. So our time travel machine takes us next to a place called Krinkelt, Belgium, where a massive assault by German forces has caught the Allies completely by surprise, the Battle of the Bulge. The date is the 17th of December, 1942. And K Company, 23rd Infantry of the 2nd Infantry Division, finds itself in the heat of battle, under siege by a superior German force. And quite frankly, all looks lost for K Company, unless by some miracle someone can hold off this German assault long enough for the soldiers of K Company to either withdraw or at least to move to positions of safety. One young soldier, acting on his own initiative, he grabs a heavy machine gun and he moves forward, firing at the German troops. He moves his machine gun from one position to another. Each time he sets up, he fires that machine gun, and each time he fires, he takes a heavy toll on the advancing German forces. Suddenly, he's blown over by a concussion of an enemy round that goes off near him. But he gets back up on his knees, he rights his machine gun, and then standing on his knees in a shallow foxhole that offers virtually no protection above the waist, he continues firing that heavy machine gun at the advancing German forces with complete and utter disregard for his own personal safety. And he fired that machine gun all that morning until eventually he ran out of ammunition. But it was just long enough for the soldiers of K Company to get to positions of safety. Somehow, miraculously, he survived this onslaught by the Nazi forces. And today, ladies and gentlemen, if you ever have the pleasure of visiting the Pentagon's famed Hall of Heroes, where America's Medal of Honor recipients are listed, you'll find his name engraved there. The name of a one-man army. The name of Private First Class Jose Lopez. A face that was Hispanic. A little-known hidden heritage of pride is the fact that during the Second World War, more Hispanic Americans were awarded the Medal of Honor than any other ethnic group. Americanism is a matter of the mind and of the heart. It is not now, nor has it ever been, a matter of race or ancestry. Thus spoke President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But at the time of the Second World War, the American Armed Forces practiced an institutional discrimination that kept many minorities, many ethnic groups out of combat units, at least initially. Despite the fact that the Selective Service Act required that all branches of the service recruit individuals from all races, the Army Air Corps had refused to allow African Americans into its ranks until the spring of 1941. It finally took an act of Congress, the Civilian Pilots Training Act and Public Law 18, but more importantly, it took a decision on the part of the Commander-in-Chief, the President of the United States, to allow African Americans into the Army Air Corps, and not just as pilots, as navigators, bombardiers, engineers, ground crew personnel. On the 21st of March in 1942, the Army Air Corps begrudgingly adhered to the will of the Congress and the direct orders of the President of the United States and established the 99th Fighter Squadron. The officers and some enlisted personnel were sent for training to Chanute Army Airfield, but the pilot trainees were sent to a place called Tuskegee in Alabama. While there still continued to be a strict limitation on the number of African Americans who could be trained as aviators, their numbers eventually rose to 966. Please allow me to repeat that number because there are those who believe that it was a mere handful of pilots. 966 combat pilots, 450 of whom flew combat actions over the Mediterranean and the European theaters of operation. 66 were shot down and lost their lives. 32 were downed and captured as prisoners of war. They earned 150 distinguished flying crosses. To the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, they were called the Schwarze Vogelmännchen, the Black Birdmen. But to the Allied bomber crews for whom they flew fighter escort, they were known simply as the Black Red-Tailed Angels because of the distinctive red paint with which they painted the tails of their aircraft, but also because of their reputation for never having lost a single Allied bomber to enemy fighter interceptors while they were flying fighter escort. One of these aviators, commander of the 99th Fighter Squadron and later commander of the 332nd Fighter Group, became only the second African American in U.S. history to be promoted to general officer rank. Lieutenant General Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. Let me share with you one final historical vignette. Our time travel machine has taken us now to the waters off the Korean Peninsula. The date is the 4th of December, 1950. You're standing on the frigid decks of the carrier USS Lady. And there taking off from the carrier Lady that day is Ensign Jesse Brown, first African-American combat aviator in U.S. naval history, and she was proud. Taking off with Ensign Brown that day was his wingman, Lieutenant Thomas Hutner. And they flew their F-4U Corsairs on an armed reconnaissance mission some 20 miles north of the Chosin Reservoir as they searched for enemy troops in the snow below. Their mission took them to within 150 meters of the ground, when suddenly Ensign Brown reported over his radio, "I must have been hit. I've lost oil pressure and I'm going in." And with that, Ensign Brown crash-landed his F-4U Corsair on a heavily wooded, snow-covered mountainside in Korea. The force of the crash landing was tremendous. The engine was torn off the aircraft, and the fuselage was bent at a 45-degree angle right at the cockpit. Somehow, miraculously, Ensign Brown was able to open the canopy and to wave overhead at his wingman, Lieutenant Hutner, who was circling overhead. But as Lieutenant Hutner looked down, he was wondering, why isn't Ensign Brown exiting the aircraft? Something else Lieutenant Hutner, the wingman, noticed as he looked down. Smoke was beginning to waft from underneath the fuselage of the aircraft, a sure sign that fire was imminent. Something must be terribly wrong because Ensign Brown was not climbing out of that aircraft. And that's when Lieutenant Hutner made an unbelievable decision. He made the decision to crash land his own perfectly sound aircraft there in the midst of hostile enemy territory because he had but one selfless thought, and that was to save the life of a friend. So Lieutenant Hutner, he jettisoned his external fuel tanks, he jettisoned his rockets, he made as if he were about to make a carrier landing, and he crash-landed his aircraft on that same heavily wooded, snow-covered mountainside in Korea. When his aircraft skidded to a halt, he threw open his canopy. He raced over to Ensign Brown's crash site, and it was as he had feared. Ensign Brown was trapped, pinned at the knees from the metal and debris of the twisted fuselage, and he was unable to get out of the aircraft. So Lieutenant Hutner climbed up behind him. He put his hands underneath his arms, and he tried to yank Ensign Brown out of the aircraft. But it was no good. Ensign Brown was pinned in fast, held tight at the knees from the metal and debris from the twisted fuselage. What's more, Ensign Brown, upon landing, had removed his gloves in order to try to release his parachute, and in so doing, his gloves had fallen to the footwell of the aircraft, out of reach, and now his hands were literally frozen stiff and of no use to him. So Lieutenant Hudner raced back over to his aircraft. He came back over with a heavy woolen scarf to wrap around Ensign Brown's hands. And he got a woolen cap and pulled it down over his head. Anything to try to preserve some of his body heat. But it was clear that Ensign Brown was fading fast, perhaps from internal injuries, the loss of blood, surely from the cold. Lieutenant Hudner went back to his aircraft, and he came back with a small fire axe from his aircraft. And with that fire axe, he was banging away at the debris that was holding Ensign Brown. But that fire axe just bounced off the metal debris as if it were a child's toy. In desperation, Lieutenant Hudner used his bare hands to heave snow onto the aircraft fire. But it was all to no avail. It was clear that Ensign Brown was fading fast. As darkness approached there on the Korean Peninsula, in the midst of hostile enemy territory. And on that 4th day of December in 1950, Ensign Jesse Brown, first African-American combat aviator in U.S. naval history, was to lose his life. But not before his fading vision beheld the face of a friend. Before he lapsed into unconsciousness for that final time, Ensign Brown stared at the face of a man who had crash-landed his own perfectly sound aircraft in the midst of hostile enemy territory, because he had but one selfless thought, and that was to save the life of a friend. He stared at the face of his wingman, Lieutenant Thomas Hudson, a face that was white. The fact that Americans of all races, women and men, have played important roles in the building of this great nation of ours is something that we all pretty much take for granted these days. What I had hoped to share with you, ladies and gentlemen, this evening is the fact that these same Americans from all ethnic groups, women and men, have also played a decisive role in the defense of our great nation, from the time of its very inception and even before that. Their courage and their exploits can be found in the pages of United States military history. It's there if one will only take the time to search for and to find the hidden heritage of pride. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for your kind indulgence and your kind attention this evening. And as you and your loved ones observe the Veterans Day holiday in the future years, I would only ask that you please pause and give a thought to those who went before us and who helped to pave the way. Veterans all, many of whom had to fight for the right to fight, to defend the flag. And were they here with us this evening in this hall, like so many ghosts, they would surely say to us with one voice that while it wasn't always easy and it wasn't always fair, but when freedom called, we answered. We were there.
There was a feeling started long ago, one bleak wintry morn, when the call went out for volunteers and a nation being born. No sunshine patriot speeches, no summer soldier song, for the special ones who paid the price to keep the country strong.
Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for your kind attention this evening. Everybody get home safe. Thank you. I'll just say one final word. God bless the USA.
Thank you all so very much. Thank you, General, for that wonderful time travel that allowed us to have a greater appreciation for those who serve our country. Before you guys go, I have a couple of things I need to do. First of all, I need to introduce to you three special guests accompanying General Cowings tonight here on the front row next to me. First of all, standing, his lovely bride, Soon Cowings. Their son, David. And just a beautiful little sweetheart, David's son, Maeve. Maeve, stand up there, all right. Thank you all for joining us tonight. And General, thank you, a little token of our appreciation for your visit here to the George Bush Presidential Library Center. It was a wonderful evening, and we got to figure out a way to spread that message a little bit more. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and good evening.